Welcome everybody to tonight's Robert Bosch lecture in public policy, which is made possible by the Robert Bosch Stiftung, whose generous support has allowed the American Academy to host two Bosch Fellows in public policy every year since 1999. I'd therefore like to extend a special welcome to Florence Wild, who is with us from the Foundation tonight. Tonight's speaker is Prerna Singh, who is the Mahatma Gandhi Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Brown University. She's also a faculty fellow at Brown's Watson Institute and a co-director of the Brown-Harvard-MIT Joint Seminar in South Asian Politics. Her first book, How Solidarity Works for Welfare, Subnationalism and Social Development in India, has won major awards, among them the American Political Science Association Woodrow Wilson's Prize for the best book published in Politics and International Relations in 2015, as well as the American Sociological Association's Barrington Moore Prize for the best book published in Comparative Historical Sociology, as well in 2015. This is extremely rare for a first book from a scholar to really make such a splash, so this already shows how special Prerna is. But Prerna became, of course, even more special, and she wouldn't be Prerna had she just stopped there. She continued. Her articles have appeared and have been published in several journals, including Comparative Political Studies, Comparative Politics, World Development, World Politics, and Studies in Comparative International Development. And Prerna, of course, excels in another sphere, and this is teaching. Among others, Prerna teaches on ethnicity and nationalism, state-society relations in China and India. We will hear more about that tonight. The politics of identity, as well as the politics of health and disease. In her project here at the American Academy, Prerna focuses on the differential effectiveness and success of public health campaigns in societies with similar demographic, socioeconomic, and health conditions. Tonight, Prerna will address this question as well and draw from her extensive research at historical archives in China and India. And she will show why the control of infectious disease has found varying levels of success in different states. Later on, and this is for the protocol, we will have a Q&A with everyone. If you would like to ask a question, please state your name and ask a question. And after that, we will move in the adjourning room for a reception with traditional German pretzels and wine. And now please join me in welcoming Prerna.
Thank you, Barrett. Thank you, Terry in absentia, the incredible staff, and my fellows here at the Academy. Thank you to the Bosch Foundation and also to the Carnegie for their generosity in making this work possible. And thank you to all of you for coming out here tonight. So, infectious diseases have long struck fear in the hearts of humans. This fear is manifest in many realms of popular culture, but because we're in Berlin and we've just concluded the Berlinale, I thought I would show you my curation of the greatest hits of the genre of epidemic infection horror. This is not my term. So none of these would be in contention for the Golden Bear, but they've all been pretty big hits at the box office. So what makes diseases so terrifying is, of course, their consequences. Most starkly human, especially since settled agriculture and the domestication of animals, diseases have been the #1 killer of humans. The 20th century was marked by unprecedented medical advances, including here in Germany, Robert Koch, a physicist and microbiologist who is often considered to be the founder of modern bacteriology. And yet, germs remain today the #1 killer of people. They've also led to massive social upheaval and continue to exact huge economic costs. The SARS epidemic alone is estimated to have cost the global economy about $52 billion US. And in addition, they have political consequences domestically. Think of the crises in newly democratic countries in Africa caused by the AIDS epidemic, as well as internationally, recent crises over Zika and Ebola, and have also emerged in the post 9/11 security climate as a security threat, as a potential agent of bioterrorism. But of course, in addition to their consequences, what makes diseases so uniquely terrifying is their mode of transmission, passing silently, invisibly across even tightly policed borders. And this is a map that shows the potential spread of an H1N1 flu virus. This is a photograph that I took a few weeks ago, should be familiar to all of you. It's the luggage carousel at Tegel Airport. The gentleman at the back yawning is probably our spirit animal for all of us who travel, waiting for their luggage on the single luggage carousel. But this poster in particular shows this idea that diseases are terrifying because they don't respect borders. And this fear of disease has, of course, intersected with fears of racial contamination, as well as fears of migration, with this interconnectedness of the world. So a couple of years ago, a lot of right-wing news outlets in Germany reported how Syrian refugees were bringing a, quote, flesh-eating disease into Germany. And this rumor then spread to news outlets in the US, and you can see the striking parallel in the way that a public health official is demonstrated in these two headlines. And yet, while the terror of disease lies in the fact that they don't respect borders, borders have historically determined our vulnerability to diseases. So polities with very similar epidemiological, socioeconomic, and political conditions have been characterized by very different levels of effectiveness in countering what I think of as equivalently severe challenges posed by a disease. And the central question of the book that I'm writing here at the Academy is, why is this the case? And so this kind of question, a comparative question about social welfare, is the kind of research that I do. So I self-identify as a comparativist. We are united by a method, which is a comparison. That's what we do. We compare different things. And as a comparativist, I work on social welfare policy and on questions of ethnicity and nationalism. And so in my first book, I took this comparative question to ask, why are states in India characterized by very different levels of social welfare? So depending on where you're born in India, you could have the life expectancy of someone in a middle-income industrialized country like Argentina, or you could have life expectancy worse than the worst countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the question is why? And this similar question of a kind of comparison towards understanding human well-being is what lies at the core of this new research project. So when you think of dominant explanations for the control of contagion, the most prominent of them is the invention of health technologies. Another one is the question of the provision of healthcare technologies, and social scientists, particularly political scientists, have done a lot of research on this. So the general idea is that the control of an infectious disease depends on the way in which a health technology is provided and is accessed. And this, in turn, has been theorized to be a product of a range of factors, such as the level of economic development, or the regime type, or ideology, political competition of different states. And I myself have in previous work emphasized ideas of social solidarity as a determinant of welfare provision. Of course, this provision can be by non-state actors who are in turn driven by a range of concerns. What I want to do, though, is move the emphasis away from this dominant emphasis on the invention and provision of technologies to instead emphasize a more societal dimension, which is the question of the uptake of health technologies. So why this focus on the uptake of technologies? Well, because the challenge we face today is in large part by diseases for which we have long had safe, widely available, and cost-effective vaccines. So think, for instance, of polio. And here I want to recommend strongly a bestseller that has had me hooked. So if I'm a little groggy today, it's because I've spent the last 2 days really immersed in this beautiful book by my fellow, Anne Finger, who will be speaking here in a few weeks, which is a personal and, I think, a really political history of polio, a disease which we continue to struggle to eradicate. Another disease, of course, is measles, which remains the #1 killer of children. 400 children a day, 16 per hour, continue to die of measles. Again, a disease for which we've long had a vaccine that's publicly available. And so this idea of why it is that the uptake of health technologies should be up and central to our understanding of the control of contagion is, of course, because this is now been identified as one of the top 10 threats to global health. So in a report published earlier this month, the WHO identified vaccine hesitancy, the refusal or reluctance to vaccinate, as one of the primary threats facing us. And this is, of course, because vaccine hesitancy has been attributed to lead to the resurgence of diseases that we thought might be behind us. So think of measles across the US. Again, a couple of weeks ago, the state of Oregon declared a public emergency because of outbreaks of measles. And this now continues to threaten Germany. These are just some of the headlines about the potential threat that disease poses in cities across Germany, as well as potentially Magda in Poland. So the question then becomes for me, what is it that determines why people, under such certain circumstances, will uptake health technologies, adopt them, and in other cases, not? And for this, I broaden my empirical scope to extend the study to the study of China and India. And in particular, I focus on a disease that has both a substantive and a theoretical convenience for me, which is smallpox. So smallpox is actually, according to many medical historians, the deadliest disease to afflict humankind. It is also a disease that is highly geopolitically important. We were discussing at dinner how some estimates say that almost 95% of the population of the New World is supposed to have succumbed to smallpox when European settlers came there around the 16th century in what is usually considered to be a precedent to bioterrorism. Think of the smallpox blankets that British colonialists distributed to Native Americans. And of course, the smallpox vaccine, in as much as it has been a deadly history, it has also been a triumphant history, because this was the first disease for which we invented a vaccine. The first and quintessential vaccine, variola vaccinea, the cowpox vaccine, which gave rise to the very term vaccine itself, and was in large part responsible for the medicalization of the population. So most historians would argue that the spread of the vaccine was the first public health measure that affected all citizens across Europe. So it's really an important moment in state building in Germany as well as in other parts of the world. And of course, it leads to the eradication of, to date, the only human disease that we have been able to eradicate. And the general hope is that polio will be the second. But from my point of view, smallpox remains important because it has emerged also as a recent bioterrorism threat. So this is a photograph of George W. Bush being himself announcing the compulsory vaccination of all first responders. Because the idea is that most of us, if we were vaccinated for smallpox, have now lost immunity. And so if this virus was spread as a potential agent of bioterrorism, it would spread with the same devastation as it might have spread in the New World, because we have no immunity to it. And because of this, George W. Bush decided to vaccinate all first responders, thereby discovering that the stockpiles of smallpox vaccine were so low that they barely really covered any proportion of the world's population. And so right now, as we speak, the WHO and the Center for Disease Control are actively building up smallpox vaccine piles. This is a photograph I took in the pediatrician's office at Harvard when my daughter was born, because smallpox is primarily a disease of small children, and it's trying to tell parents and pediatricians, who of course have no experience with this disease, how to distinguish smallpox from chickenpox, a disease with which it was historically confused. What I do, and which is what makes smallpox so convenient, is that it has a beginning point, the invention of the vaccine, and it has an end point, which is the eradication of smallpox. And so within that, the book is structured around 3 sets of empirical comparisons of cities across China and India, provinces within India, and then a comparison of the countries of China and India towards understanding why this vaccine met with differential uptake. And so that's the chapter breakdown. And what I will be talking to you today really is primarily the first part of it, which is what explained the differential spread of this vaccine in these two, I'm going to hopefully convince you, otherwise quite similar cities of Canton and Calcutta. And that's what that sheet of paper on your chairs is. And no, Fred, there will be no quiz. I'm traumatized by Indian examination systems, so I hate administering any test of any sort. So what is it that explains the uptake of health technologies? The general argument that I want to convince you of is that it has to do with communication by an authoritative institution of a technology that is embedded in a motivational frame. And I know that's a little wordy, so I'll break it up basically by saying there needs to be an institution and there needs to be an idea. The institution is the messenger, and I think of the idea as the message. And essentially what I want to say is that you need to have an authoritative institution that communicates the health technology, but the health technology has to be one that motivates people. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by this. So what do we know about why people take up or do not take up a health technology? In a quite important article in the journal Pediatrics, Brendan Nyhan and co-authors did a nationally representative experiment, and they gave 4 different types of interventions to about 2,000 parents with children under the age of 17 across the US. The first one was they told them that there is no relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism. That's the link that's often put together. Secondly, they gave them text-based information that if you don't get your child vaccinated with the MMR vaccine, this is what measles looks like. This was a description. In the third intervention, they showed them a photograph of a child with measles and said, look, this is what could happen to your kid if you don't get the vaccine. And the fourth intervention was a kind of very dramatic story of a child who almost dies of measles. The results of this, as they report, and this is quotes from the article, is none of these interventions increased parental intent to vaccinate a future child. The conclusions that they draw from this is that current public health communication about vaccines may not be effective, and for some parents, this is the really tricky part, it may actually increase misperceptions or reduce vaccination intention. So for psychologists, this is actually not so surprising because we know, and this New Yorker issue summarized it, is that facts don't change our minds. And so the general idea is that we are Bayesian information processors, that we take on new information, we process this, and of course, we act in rational self-interest and change our mind. But we know that we are actually motivated reasoners, that there is biased reasoning, that all kinds of other things, quote, corrupt our reasoning, bias it. And so in some senses, this is where my argument comes in to say we know that giving people information is not what leads them to change their minds and their behavior. And so what does? And so to me, this is a theory of persuasion and of motivation. And I want to show you that there are 2 possible ways in which a vaccination could be more likely to be accepted. And the first is through a cognitively motivating frame, and the second one is an affectively motivating one. And I'll talk quickly about what I mean. But the basic insight is about how do we process information. And I want to rely on 3 psychological insights about how we process information to develop this theory. The first is an idea of authority. So an idea of who we trust, who we think of as legitimate, are important components of whether we take a certain message, including a public health message, on board. The second is the power of the prior, so the role that established beliefs play in the way that we process new information. And thirdly, the role of emotions, or what have been called hot processes in decision-making. So the first one, that is this cognitively motivating frame for the control of contagion. And so psychologists have told us over generations that humans have a preference for the familiar. So I'll just give you an example of two psychologists, important ones of two very different generations, Leon Festinger, writing in the 1960s, and Daniel Kahneman, writing today, who have both come to the same insight. So Festinger calls it the striving for cognitive consonance. And he says for new information to be understood or to be thought of as useful, we must find schema with which to link this new stimulus to previously understood experiences. Kahneman calls this an idea of cognitive ease. He says when statements are linked to established beliefs or understandings, they're more likely to be believable. And this preference for the familiar has been an important theory, surprise, surprise, by marketing, in organizational research, in textbooks, in education, but also, interestingly, in tourism. So in an old tourist manual written by psychologists, actually encouraging American tourists to visit after the Second World War Europe and to spend their money to rebuild these fledgling European economies, they were trying to introduce them to or encourage them to having more culinary adventures. And so one of them was getting them to try different kinds of food, which they might not have tried. And so the idea was always to link these new foods, whether it was escargot or frog legs. And so the famous one was frog legs. The idea that frog legs taste just like crispy chicken legs. The second way in which we process information that does not in a sense, fit with rational actor models, but has been found to be increasingly important across philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience, is the effect of emotion on judgment and decision-making. And this is a graph that shows the number of papers that began to talk about the importance of emotion in, I think it's across all psychology journals. Yes, this was an article in the Annual Review of Psychology. And the blue line is actually a measure of the percentage of all published articles that mention emotion in theories of decision-making. So you can see how this is a growing movement to take on board emotion in how we make our decisions. As an aside, there's a very interesting anecdote about a railway worker in the US in the 19th century who has this kind of bizarre accident by which a rod goes through his brain. And, correct me if I'm wrong because I see you nodding, Raji, but I think it affects the way that he processes emotion, but not his cognitive abilities. So they find that on all IQ tests, he actually does really well. He's completely functioning and able, but the part of his brain that's injured is the part that processes emotion. And yet what they find is while he does really well on all these IQ tests, he's unable to reach a decision. And that was usually considered to be the beginning of this theorizing about how emotions are necessary for us to be able to make decisions. And so this, in a sense, is research continuing in that tradition. So returning to this question about the differential control of contagion, what I want to show you now is some empirical evidence from one part of the book that tries to show how this particular theory, particularly the cognitive side of what I've described, explains the differential control of disease in the cities of Canton and Calcutta. So as social scientists, if I have to convince you of my explanation, I have to first try to tell you that all other explanations or most other explanations do not hold. So towards doing that, we construct what we call controlled comparisons. We like to pretend that we are scientists, therefore the term political science. And so what the handout you have, which I'm not going to go into in much detail, is basically an attempt to try to tell you that these two cities, located in a very similar, relatively similar part of the world, but as you can see, longitudinally, it means that they're both subtropical, humid climates, port cities, and have a very similar disease profile. I'm also going to show you that they were similar on a number of other factors, which might be hypothesized to influence the way in which vaccines were provided and received. And what I want to argue is that it wasn't all these other factors, because we can control for them, but instead the argument that I'm about to make for you that explains why Canton had a much more rapid and enthusiastic adoption of a vaccine as compared to Calcutta. So as I said, these are epidemiologically, climatically, extremely similar cities. They are also demographically similar with high rates of migration, very, in a way, unbalanced gender ratios, which reflect male migration in the labor force into these two cities. They're ethnically diverse and also have relatively high rates of literacy. This is usually for Canton an estimate that most China scholars tell me is an overestimate by Evelyn Roski. But it is one that I use because if it's lower, then it actually helps my case even more. So demographically similar, climatically similar, economically similar. These are both cities that have both a very wealthy merchant class as well as a high degree of inequality with a large poor migrant underclass. I mean, the two cities, Canton and Calcutta, trade between Canton and Calcutta is really undergirding the entire British imperialist enterprise at this point in time. And this, I apologize, is I've been assured a very mediocre piece of art, but it is by far my favorite. I mean, you can't even invent this stuff, but these are the Money brothers who worked for the East India Company. Their father, Mr. Money, also worked for the East India Company. And as you can see, the two brothers, the middle and the youngest is pointing there to the city of Canton, and the middle brother is pointing to the city of Calcutta, indicating to you how in the imaginary of the East India Company, these two cities, they're kind of central importance. So in addition to being economically important, these are both politically important cities. Calcutta is actually the capital of British India at this point in time. Canton is the administrative center for South China, and the Governor General for Guangdong and Guangxi sits in Canton. Guangzhou prefecture's seat is also there. So I'm kind of quickly just going over these conditions that you might think could influence the differential uptake of the vaccine. They both have infectious disease burdens because of subtropical humid climates, and they also have a high incidence of smallpox. In fact, China and India usually compete for this moniker of the cradle of smallpox because the beginnings of smallpox are usually traced to the second century in Canton and about almost the first millennium in Calcutta. And the theories of what causes smallpox, because of course it's an ancient disease, are quite similar. So in both Canton and Calcutta, they are usually seen as visitations by a goddess who has both a kind of cruel but also quite a benevolent side. This is Sitla, whose temples you can still see dotting the Indian countryside. And this is Tou Shen Nyang Nyang, the Chinese smallpox goddess. She's represented in many different ways. This is just one. And in addition to this theory of causation, which is a visitation by the goddess, the treatment for smallpox is also quite similar. So there is a worship of the goddess. There are dietary rules, usually a cooling diet, because smallpox is seen as an eruption of heat. And in addition, a lot of behavior that is prohibited. But most critically, from my point of view, there is actually a well-established prophylactic, indigenous prophylactic of variolation, or what is often termed inoculation. And you'll forgive me for a second for just going into this just a little bit, which is what this is. And so what was known about smallpox at this point in time was that once you got it, you were home free. And so the idea that developed, and there's some debate about when it developed and where it developed. Theories say that it developed actually simultaneously in China and India. Others say it developed in India and traveled into China. Basically, the idea was if you can give yourself a mild case of smallpox in childhood, then you're saved from the wild smallpox that you might be afflicted by when an epidemic rolls around. And so variolation, which was practiced by skilled practitioner, basically meant that, say, Barrett had a mild case of smallpox. Her scabs would be taken, attenuated, often by a cycle or two, a season or two. And then this dried human smallpox scab would be used to give, for instance, Lucy immunity so that she would not contract smallpox in the case of an epidemic. So the way that this happened in most of China was by nasal insufflation. So a variolator would come with these dried smallpox scabs, and children would, I think the easy way to do this is basically like snorting coke. Your nose is a very highly porous membrane. Now in the US, you can get flu shots via the nose. And so you would take these smallpox scabs via the nose. Of course, it was potentially dangerous because you might not have as mild a case as Barrett did. And of course, the critical thing is you're still contagious because you're actually getting smallpox. And so your parents could send you to school, or you could wander off and actually create an epidemic, which was what variolators were accused of doing. But this was actually also very effective practice that travels from China and India via Constantinople, and this very courageous lady who then spreads it into Europe. And so what I want to just kind of say, because this will become important, is that this is a well-developed practice in both China and India at the time when vaccination comes in. The difference in India is that actually variolation looks a lot more like vaccination. So there's no nasal insufflation. In India, it's like a little mark into your arm. So in a way, the technology of vaccination is much more similar in Calcutta than it is in Canton. There's also, you could also wear the clothes of a child who had contracted smallpox, but nasal insufflation was by far the most popular according to the historical records. So the vaccine that is invented by Jenner, and it's an interesting debate whether you say discovered by Jenner or invented by Jenner, because, and this goes back to variolation, Jenner's father was a variolator. Jenner's kind of main invention or discovery that came from his famous remark that cow maidens in England who looked after cows were some of the most beautiful women, and that's because their faces were not disfigured by smallpox. The reason they were not disfigured by smallpox is because of their work with cows. They usually contracted cowpox, a disease that I think is quite unpleasant if you're a calf, but if you're a human, you just get a few scabs and that's it. But then you're protected from smallpox. And so Jenner realized and experimented on himself and his children that if we just gave each other cowpox, then we didn't get smallpox. And so that's the degree of discovery or invention. So this vaccine, invented, discovered by Jenner, comes to Canton and Calcutta via quite elaborate routes at exactly the same point in time, introduced by the same actor, the East India Company. I also want to argue that the institutions of the way in which it was provided were quite similar. It was made available through dispensaries and traveling vaccinators. And there was also a big challenge about how to maintain this lymph because these were hot and humid climates, and it turns out no cows in India or China actually get cowpox. So you had to import the cowpox lymph, and so it was quite a complicated procedure to keep the lymph alive, and then also very inefficient technology. But all of this is constant across these two cities. So to me, the puzzle is why, if all of these other conditions are similar, do you see this, which is within half a century of the introduction of this vaccine and high rates of variolation, why do you see 85% of the population uptake vaccination in Canton while it's a minuscule figure in Calcutta? And what I want to argue is that this really has to do with differences in popular attitudes towards the vaccine. And before I get to my own explanation, the one kind of elephant in the room that I want to mention is colonialism. So most scholars would argue that the reason that the vaccine did not meet with an enthusiastic response in Calcutta was because, of course, this is a colonial government that is introducing it. But this is actually not quite the colonial government. This is still early days of the East India Company. Moreover, it's not that all colonial interventions in India are actually rejected. I mean, I would say English is as much my first language as Hindi. And it's also well before a lot of draconian public health interventions that come later in the century. So the only standing official to be assassinated in all of India's history with British colonialism was actually the plague commissioner of the city of Pune. So this gives you an indicator of just how draconian public health legislation became. But this is a long time before that. So what I'm trying to argue to you is that colonialism is important, but not quite in this decisive way in which we might think of the rejection of the vaccine as necessarily a rejection of the colonization of the body, or that it was resisted as a tool of empire, especially because most historians will tell us that the people who came to vaccinate you were not seen as colonial agents. And often the person who came to vaccinate you was the same person who used to come to variolate you. And so this idea that this was a kind of opposition to a colonial power, is not quite as simple as a lot of subaltern studies scholars have, I think, made it seem. Especially because even though China is not colonized in the same way as India, Canton has a deep-seated suspicion of foreigners. In Chinese, they're often called foreign devils or big-nosed barbarians. And the main association at that point is with opium, which is not by any means a positive association. So, what then explains this difference? And what I want to argue to you is that it is the fact that vaccine in Canton, the smallpox vaccine, is endorsed by an authoritative institution. In particular, this is the gentry, who are often state officials, degree holders, occasionally prominent merchants, who are often considered to be this key link between state and society. These gentry write prefaces and commission reprints of this one medical pamphlet that is I think of as a kind of blockbuster medical pamphlet called In Do Liu. And my research assistants and I are still trying to kind of put all these reprints and prefaces together. But this has almost 60 different reprints and 50 different prefaces written to this little medical pamphlet by a small-time vaccinator by the name of Chiu Shi. So what is this pamphlet and why is it important? What I want to say is that this pamphlet constitutes a sinicization of vaccination and embedding an existing understanding that allows vaccination to be understood and adopted. So this is technically a translation. It's technically a translation of a pamphlet written by the Surgeon General of the East India Company called Alexander Pearson, who wrote a little book to introduce vaccination into China called The Extraordinary History of a New Method of Inoculation Discovered in the Kingdom of England. Chiu Shi decided this was too long a title and really there needed to be no mention of England. So he basically vernacularizes and sinicizes this by changing the title and makes it just a brief account of inducing the pox. He rewrites this whole pamphlet in the style and the writing of a traditional Chinese medicine text. He also adds a whole theory of how vaccination works. So one of the reasons why Jenner faces a lot of pushback from the medical community in England is because he doesn't know how the vaccine works. All he knows is that if you get cowpox, which calves get and are miserable, but you get and are not, you're protected from smallpox. But there's no theory about what is it that is leading the vaccine to work. And so Chiu Shi decides, we really need a theory. And so he adds the same theory through which smallpox has historically been understood, which is that it is a fetal toxin. Because as a child, you're too young to have sinned when you get the disease. So this is a sin that you inherit from your parents. And so he adds this whole section of this fetal toxin, Taidu, of how vaccination works. He also adds or maintains pre- and post-operative rituals and diets associated with the disease and with variolation. He also adds various herbal formulas. This angers Jenner no end. He says, the whole idea about vaccination is that it's a one-shot thing. What are all these kind of, weird, suspicious, superstitious things being added? But this is the frame that is then broadcast by the gentry. Most critically, what Chiu Shi does is that he justifies this new method of an incision of a new element into the body through the theory of meridian acupuncture. Because recall, before this, there was no incision into the body. There was a nasal insufflation or transfer through old clothes, old blankets. So he adds a whole section in this little medical pamphlet, complete with figures which were certainly not there in Pearson's original volume, talking about how the vaccine should be administered on certain points that correspond to meridian points in acupuncture. And this is a part of the sinicization, the cognitive embedding, the cultural embedding of vaccination that the historiography thinks was a very important one, because it made this leap of making this incision into the body both understandable, but also, in a sense, a continuation of the established regimen. So in Calcutta, what happens is that there is a much more diffuse structure of authority. The gentry, in a sense, consolidate social, economic, and political power. There is no such institution in colonial Calcutta. This authority is both diffuse, but also not very legitimate. On the one hand, it's the East India Company, and on the other hand, it's the Brahmins. But because of the caste system, the Brahmins are at the top of the caste hierarchy, but do not have any kind of an institutional, affective, or even a sense, they do not have either an affective link, nor are they necessarily seen as a legitimate authority through which a message could be communicated by other castes. So the combination of the East India Company and a social structure based on caste means that there isn't an authoritative institution to be able to put out a message in the same way as there exists in Canton. More critically, the frame in which this new technology is embedded is not one of cognitive consonance, but actually one of cognitive dissonance. And think there of the incentive structure of the East India Company that wants to the kind of Kipling idea of the civilizing mission. And the vaccine is really the first moment in which the British think they have something that constitutes an improvement over indigenous medical understandings. Because until this point in time, the British are busy using traditional language to compile materia medica and of using traditional Indian remedies to develop their own arsenal. This is the point of like heroic bloodletting in Europe. So the frame that gets constructed portrays vaccine as foreign and as a break from the existing understandings. So now there is no respect to seasonality. The idea was that you were only varulated at certain times of the year. No longer the case. You could be vaccinated anytime, and you should be vaccinated anytime. There was no pre or post-operative care. And most critically, there was no allowance to a prayer to the goddess, Sitla. So it's interesting. So as Barrett mentioned, a lot of this research is based in archives. A lot of the Indian archives are actually in London. But if you reread the colonial documents on which the Subaltern Studies School, which emphasizes colonialism as the decisive factor in, for instance, the rejection of vaccination, if you reread their own archives, to me it's interesting how what really constitutes the source of opposition is not so much that it's introduced by a colonial power, but that it is seen as a rejection of the existing way of doing things. In particular, and this is a quote from the Surgeon General in Banaras, present-day Uttar Pradesh, who says, the principal objection to vaccination is that it is done without any puja or sacrificial offering. And in reporting this, he is really summarizing these letters that vaccinators are writing. And then you have this kind of Surgeon General's report that takes, in a way, the most often reported, the greatest hits of the complaints, because they're really trying to understand why people are objecting or hesitating towards this vaccine. And so the principal one that is brought out again and again in these reported reports is that the goddess is missing. David Arnold, who's usually seen as the kind of vanguard of the Subaltern Studies School, particularly as regards the question of medicine, even he talks about this opposition between the ritualized practice of variolation and the, quote, raw secularity of vaccination. And so what it comes down to is that not only is there no institution which can embed a frame with the authority, the legitimacy, but also that the frame itself makes vaccination feel like an attack rather than a propitiation of the goddess. And so it's interesting, again, because this is from Arnold, who would usually be seen as a representative of an alternate explanation. He says, when vaccination was accepted, or it was seen as desirable, many middle-class households treated it exactly as they had variolation. So they chose an auspicious day. They would usually consult a priest, who would consult an almanac, who would come up with an auspicious day for the vaccination. They would observe all the old rituals, the bathing, the diet, all the taboos, and they would employ a priest. So the vaccinator would come around, but they would also make sure that the vaccinator was accompanied by a priest, who would then invoke the goddess of smallpox, Sitala, thanking her rather than Jenna Sahib for the child's safe passage. And so to me, this is interesting because, again, this is Arnold reporting on his own archival sources. So essentially, the argument that I want to make is that if you really just looked at the technology, the gap between the technology in Canton was a much larger one to bridge. In Calcutta, and indeed, this was a complaint of people who were overseeing vaccination, is that they would say, they would usually come to a little hillock and stand as the vaccinators fanned into the village. And they said, we don't know whether they are vaccinating or variolating, because the procedure looks exactly the same. And so in a sense, the technological similarity would lead us to predict that actually it should have been Calcutta that might have seen the more rapid uptake of this technology. But instead, it's actually Canton and so to me, that kind of deepens the puzzle and makes it that much more exciting to explain. So the kind of long and short of it, what I want you to take away from this is that there's an institutional mechanism through the gentry and no such institution in a dispersed structure of authority in Canton as compared to Calcutta, and the ideational mechanism, which is that vaccination is sinicized in line with existing beliefs and behavior in Canton, but is seen as foreign and contradicting existing beliefs and behaviors, and that these together, this institutional and ideational mechanism, explain the differential uptake of this technology and consequently the control of contagion. So, in conclusion, I want to take you back and make the argument that the way that I see my work, even though I took you into a pretty specific historical neck of the woods right now, is really about how we see the world and what motivates us. And in particular, what I hope to do here, as well as in my broader work, is to move away from ideas of homo economicus, the idea that we are rational actors, that we are Bayesian information processors, that we are cost-benefit calculators, that we are strategic actors, to a much richer and more nuanced understanding of human motivation that takes on board the role of ideas, the role of beliefs, the role of identity, the role of emotions. And so in my first book, I tried to argue that ideas of identity and solidarity are the critical determinants of social welfare policy. I showed historically that states in India that have much better welfare provision, particularly education and health, are states that have had much stronger senses of collective solidarity. So the idea that when you feel a sense of we-ness, you're more likely to prioritize the collective good. And so I showed how this move from a me to a we identity leads to a prioritization of collective social welfare. And in this book, I hope to be able to show that similar non-strategic motivations, the role of beliefs, norms, values, emotions, are also important predictors of human behavior. And what I want to end with is that when we begin to take this richer understanding of how we see the world and how we behave, it moves us away from what I think of as quite despairing images such as this to a much more beautiful, uplifting image such as this, made by my fellow Jessie Ball, who will be here in 48 hours talking to us about writing. And I think that if you move away towards this other picture, we move away from focusing on what doesn't change our minds to instead trying to understand what does change our minds. Thank you.
On embedding public health policies in traditional contexts. And this actually raises the question of strategic implications of today's political discourse, which becomes more and more global. I wonder what, with your research in hand, focusing on a traditional context, policymakers actually, what they can learn from it and how they can translate it into concrete policies. Or are there already concrete policy programs that take your research into account?
So I wish I could say that they take my research into account, but I hope at some point they will. But I think that I think if I understand your question, I do think that there are many ways in which public health programs today are beginning to realize the importance of both this institutional and this ideational mechanism towards a more effective communication of health technologies. So one, there is an emphasis and increasing recognition that while questions of provision are very important, that it is this question of how do you persuade, how do you communicate, and I think that that part of it, I think most public health, most people in public health, most states are beginning to recognize. I also think that there is a recognition of the importance of sources of authority, of who communicates and what is communicated. So in a sense, I think perhaps the most striking example is that of the AIDS, is the way in which AIDS was dealt with, and particularly the rollout of antiretrovirals in South Africa. So initially, traditional healers, sangomas, were seen as public enemy number one because they were often prescribing herbal medication that was seen to be at odds with antiretrovirals. They were seen as backward, as encouraging a superstitious and non-scientific way of seeing AIDS. And then gradually the Gates Foundation, but also a number of actors, began to realize that actually there was a way in which these sources of authority, because the sangomas, the traditional healers, exercised a great degree of authority. And so I think it's quite important to think about what are local sources of authority. Are they village elders? Are they the clergy? Are they members of the civil society? Are they a political party? Are they state officials at various levels? And what exactly are the existing beliefs and understandings? So in a sense, it's also an argument for cultural sensitivity and for seeing how an intervention that is new fits in with this idea of the old. And I think sometimes because health technologies have this kind of eureka moment, they've just been invented, now they're being rolled out, there is an emphasis and a tendency to emphasize their newness. And yet I think that actually runs counter to what we know about ourselves, which is that we prefer the old, we prefer the familiar. So it's quite interesting because so sangomas became very critical in the rollout of the antiretrovirals. They were consulted, their herbal medications were often included as a part of the regimen, and they became key delivery agents. And so I think that might be an example of how a traditional source of authority and a frame for AIDS that recognized existing understandings of the disease and established treatments allowed for, I think, a much more effective uptake of antiretrovirals.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Kate, you start right here, and then...
Hi, Jenny Allen, Yale University, but also a current fellow here. Thank you, Prerna. That was a really fascinating talk. And I'd like to push you, since you tantalized us with your table of contents, on how this story continues into the 20th century. So you gave us what I thought was a really convincing argument of what happens in the 19th century, a compelling history and also a compelling argument. And it flashed by, and I didn't quite catch it. But if I recall correctly, actually, despite the real disparity over the course of the 19th century, it's only within a couple of decades of one another that China and India eradicate smallpox. So I'm curious from just a historical and analytical standpoint, what happens over the course of the 20th century? And then I'm also curious, sort of from a methodological standpoint, you shift from this 19th century analysis of two cities to a comparison of the national, which that presents you with a whole set of different methodological challenges. So could you just talk about the last two chapters in some ways of this project and tell us how the story ends?
Absolutely. Actually, see, I knew it. I can see into the future. I need my slides. Could I have them back? No, I need my slides.
I thought you asked for them.
Remember, I used to have some slides?
Stefan, can you?
You'll be getting them. It's on the way.
It's here. Okay. Well, I'm sure the screen will appear. But thank you, Jenny. I appreciate the question. So the way that so what I showed you, I argued that there was a motivating frame in which a health technology needed to be embedded. And what I showed you from the 19th century was this idea of a cognitively consonant frame. And what the 20th century allows me to do is show you another way in which a health technology can also be embedded in a motivational frame, and that is the role of emotion. So the way that the book is structured, and so this also gets to your methodological question, is that different parts of the book show different parts of the argument. And in particular, what I hope that the 19th century comparison of the two cities will do is allow you to see how this notion of the cognitive consonance works and the power of the familiar. And what the 20th century comparison of the two countries will allow you to do is to show you the role of emotion. So if I had my slides, I would show you some posters. Am I getting that?
Yeah.
I think, yeah, we're
Okay.
we don't see it, but
Okay.
we're working on
yeah,
that.
Sorry. So though, only because the posters are actually quite exciting. But so India and China have about a 15-year lag in the eradication of smallpox. So in a sense, that doesn't sound like it's very much, but it is. I mean, 15 years is a huge amount of time in terms of eradicating a disease and the potential number of people who are dying of this disease. So the way in which I structure the second comparison is to look at this gap of about 15 years between the eradication of the disease. And what I show you in that chapter is that China manages to eradicate smallpox mostly through an appeal to nationalism. And that's where the role of emotion comes in. So smallpox vaccination in the context of an ongoing war with the US in Korea becomes a patriotic duty. So it gets embedded, a few years later begin the patriotic health campaigns, but the posters will show you how smallpox is basically, the invoking is the invoking of an allegiance to the nation. So again, in terms of how we process information and why we're likely to adopt a technology, the general idea, again, here is to show you another pathway to that, which is the role of emotion. India does not do that. And when it eventually does eradicate smallpox, it does it with the help of the WHO. And so these are the posters that I was talking about. This is a propaganda poster that says, "Vaccinate everyone to crush the germ warfare of American imperialism." This is quite interesting, Barrett, because it gets to your question about the contemporary day. And so it's interesting how a number of scholars have pointed out the similarity in a poster used in the SARS epidemic in 2002 and the germ warfare posters used in China in the 1950s. So there was a similar appeal to patriotism and nationalism that also was used in the contemporary period. What I want to show you again, and so the basic argument is again the role of nationalist emotion. These are some of the posters that both invoke nationalism, but also invoke cultural similarities. So there's someone called Leaping Boo who has done a content analysis of these posters, and she shows how certain figures, the use of certain colors, the use of certain calligraphy techniques are deliberate in order to kind of link these vaccination campaigns to existing cultural understanding. So she, for instance, has an article that shows the similarity between these posters and traditional calendars and almanacs that are also published. In India, you don't have a similar frame that is broadcast by the national government. What is so interesting in a kind of crazy way is that the posters that they do use are actually considered to be quite offensive. So this was a poster that was used in the 1960s in the smallpox eradication campaign. So it shows a, quote, superhero with a lancet who is attacking the smallpox devil. But as you know, and smallpox was a visitation by the goddess. And so actually a patient of smallpox was also worshipped. And so a poster such as this, with both portrayed smallpox as a demon and as something to be attacked rather than worshipped, was also seen as quite offensive. In a crazy story, which I'll just go into in a second, eventually what leads to the eradication of smallpox in India is a very concerted program by the World Health Organization. India is one of the last countries in the world to eradicate smallpox. And this is the definitive account of the eradication of smallpox written by someone called Larry Brilliant, who used to be a doctor to the Grateful Dead. There's a documentary made about him called Rock Doc. He's also in Times' list of top 100 most influential people. He's a TED awardee. I see George nodding. He has a lovely autobiography called Sometimes Brilliant. But what is so incredible about this quite dry book is its dedication. And this dedication, which I think the lesson is always read dedications, which I do, led me down a very interesting track, which goes to your point, Jenny, about how even the 1950s allow me to show through different empirical evidence the same argument for the importance of embedding a health technology in a culturally familiar frame. So the reason why this is dedicated to someone called Neem Karoli Baba on the top left, he is the Baba to Timothy Leary of the Harvard psychedelic experiments, also his collaborator Ramdas, who were fired from Harvard for giving LSD to undergraduates. So Neem Karoli Baba lives in the Himalayas at the border of India and Nepal and is attracting, everyone from Timothy Leary to Steve Jobs. Unfortunately, Steve Jobs arrives about a few months after he passes away, but also Larry Brilliant. And it's recounted in all of these WHO documents in Geneva that Larry Brilliant comes, and there are records of this because they're writing letters. The Southeast Asian Regional Office is writing letters back to the WHO in Geneva, and I have all these letters. And they're saying, this long-haired hippie wearing a kurta pajama has come to the office of the WHO and is saying that he has been sent by his Baba to eradicate smallpox. It's a true story. Larry Brilliant actually recounts it in his memoir. And Nicole Grasset, who is the French head of the WHO Southeast Asian Regional Office, sends this long-haired hippie back saying, what is this? So in his own account, Larry Brilliant goes back, finds a suit, trims his hair and his beard. That's him there with his wife Girija, and comes back and says, no, really, truly, I've been meditating, because his Baba keeps sending him back and says, our mission is to spread joy and peace in the world. This is a disease that has killed millions, particularly children, and you are to eradicate it. And this is your mission, and I see it. And so Larry Brilliant goes back. But for my purposes, what is so interesting is that he culturally embeds a program that the Indian government has had a lot of success, a lot of lack of success in embedding. Remember, they have been disseminating this poster. He comes back and he realizes that, parents will hide from the smallpox vaccinator, but they will not hide from the goddess. And so I've done these interviews with the survivors, few, unfortunately, of the smallpox eradication campaign, who talk about how Larry Brilliant came up with this idea of having the smallpox vaccination camps at the goddesses' temples. Because some member of the family would usually come there, and you would probably not come to the temple unless someone you knew had contracted smallpox. And so there is a kind of cultural embedding, ironically, by the WHO, not so much by the Indian government, that allows for a kind of similar mechanism to kick in. So, these are just some posters and some photographs of of them doing this. But the basic idea, again, is that a frame endorsed by WHO and local health workers becomes the motivating frame in the 20th century. And the methodological thing is deliberate. I want it to be a comparison of cities, provinces within India, and then the countries of China and India, also to account for differences in regime type. I'm a political scientist, so I began this project actually with this part of it. So when I first presented, I was presenting on the 1950s, and every political scientist in the room would raise their hand and be like, there is no puzzle here. This is all a question of communism versus democracy. Because we think of regime type as this very determinative factor. And so in order to show that actually it's not communism and democracy, but something that goes further back, that's how I kind of kept backing into this historic neck of the woods, into imperial China and colonial India.
Hi, my name is Raji. I loved it. I find it super compelling. But let me just play devil's advocate by putting two alternative explanations out there, and you'll tell me very quickly why I'm totally wrong. Okay, so here's, and I know nothing about this stuff. Okay, so theory number one. You mentioned as you were talking that the reason a priori you may think that in India they'd be more likely to adopt this is that they had incision, which is somehow more closely related to a vaccination. So here's another idea, that because an incision is invasive, if you like, is it possible that they viewed those things as closer substitutes, and in that sense are less likely to switch from incision to vaccination? That was number one. And the other thing is, I know very little about, Chinese history in the period that you're talking about, or Chinese history in any period. But you mentioned sort of in passing that this is a time of the opium wars or the opium epidemic. To what extent might, not communist regime, but coercion then be an alternative theory in the Chinese context as opposed to the Indian one?
Thank you. Thank you. Those are excellent questions. On the first part, the historiography on this is, of course, is difficult to read in terms of, the ideal situation would be to do a kind of survey experiment historically, right, and go back and ask people why they adopted a vaccine, why they didn't. And I'm actually working to try this. I'm writing a piece about, you're an economist, so you know this. Political scientists have a big inferiority complex as regard economists. We always try to do what we think economists are doing, and right now it's experiments. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is try to say how comparative historical analysis can actually inform better experiments or better theories to test through experiments. But so short of being able to do any of that historically, the answer to your question that I can muster at this moment is that I'm not sure. I think you're right that these could be seen as potential substitutes. But to me, it still leaves open the question of why is it that if then it is seen as a substitute, it is met with the degree of apathy that it is, or potentially opposition. But I take your point about the fact that, maybe because then it could go either way, It could be that if they're seen as a substitute and they're seen as neutral substitutes, then maybe you stick with the variolation. But if you think of it as a substitute, then to me, a priori, it's not clear why you would necessarily reject something that you see as a kind of, quick interchange. You have to see it as in somehow different enough for you to have an opinion to say not this, but this. So that's just more thinking logically. It's not actually going back to the archives, but thank you. I will go back to the archives with that. On the second point about coercion, which I think is a real concern in communist China, and again was part of the reason why there are these different paths to the project. Because I think it's not possible to rule out coercion as a potential explanation, but I rely here really on the work of others. I think of Sebastian Heilmann here in the audience, co-author Elizabeth Perry, and a lot of others, Nara Dillon, who have spoken about how the role of coercion is often exaggerated and the role of cultural persuasion is underestimated in the spread of technology, but also critically ideology in China. So Elizabeth Perry, who Sebastian has written a book with, a lovely book called Mao's Long Shadow, about historical continuities, talks about the way in which, I think of her argument and my argument as quite closely in sync, because she says her argument is really about how a foreign ideology takes root, and mine is about how a foreign technology takes root. And she shows through a study of An Yuan that Marxism, communism, takes root in China because it is culturally embedded. So she talks about the role of secret societies, dragon dances, and a variety of other cultural repertoires which the Communist Party used to make communism comprehensible and appealing to residents of the Chinese countryside. And so in a sense, it's a very similar argument about how decades before that, a similar technology was embedded in these kind of cultural frames. So I don't think that there is a way in which we can quite discount the influence of coercion, but what I can also say is that the democratic Indian state in the 1950s is highly coercive. The family planning campaign, forced sterilization in India, and these predate the declaration of the national emergency by Indira Gandhi in the 1970s, and also in the smallpox eradication campaign. So this book that I was referring to has many incidents of forced rounding up of people for smallpox vaccination. And one of the lasting regrets that Larry Brilliant, along with Bill Feige, and a number of people involved in the smallpox eradication campaign of the WHO, is they've all had these mea culpas of, we were involved in active coercion, particularly towards the last phase of the eradication campaign. So all to say that, yes, of course, there might have been coercion, but certainly also coercion under a democratic regime, which continues in democratic regimes, sadly, across the world.
Thank you. Celia Häusermann, I'm a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg and also a political scientist. I have a very short question. So is it the message or is it the messenger? Because you mentioned both variables, but your two cases actually co-vary on both.
Yeah.
In the Chinese case, you have both the authority and the message, and you have neither of both in the Indian case. So you seem to kind of lack the off-diagonal cases to make the argument.
Yeah. I love political scientists. So I do have one. I do. I really do. Because this is... So I do. So yes, you're right. In these, the message and the messenger are both, the message is aligned cognitively or affectively, and then the messenger is authoritative, so it works beautifully. So I have a 2x2. We all have 2x2s, which I don't unfortunately have here. So, and that's where so what Jenny was pushing me towards, the table of contents, that's what the second empirical chapter does. It breaks open the 2x2. So the provinces in India allow me to separate out the message and the messenger. So one of the things that I show, and this goes against, again, the argument that a colonial state is what was responsible for the opposition, so in the state of Madras presidency, a province within colonial India, there is actually a really creative attempt by two East India Company officials to embed vaccination. So they are reading these reports, they are vaccination officials, and they realize that the primary objection to vaccination is because it is seen as an attack on the goddess and because it is seen as foreign. And this, again, going to the really high degree of cultural and linguistic literacy of these early East India Company officials, they write these poems, which they claim are from an ancient Tamil text, saying that because Hindus revere the cow, and this vaccine comes from the cow, this is actually from this old text. And they publish this as a letter to the daily Madras Mail. And so good is their hoax. This gets called in the historiography the pious hoax. So if you Google the pious hoax, you'll see the whole trajectory of this. And so it's only 5 years ago that historians and linguists actually conclusively determined that this was a hoax, because they kept trying to find the ancient Tamil scripture. And so that to me shows that you had the message. You had a cognitively aligned message. But there was no authority, no authoritative institution that could lift that message and broadcast it. The East India Company would not do it because, in a sense, it did not align with their incentive structure after the rise of Macaulay. So there's this move from Orientalism to the Anglicis. Macaulay famously says, the history of India is not worth anything, and so there's the infamous Macaulay's Minute. So at that moment, no one picks up on this pious hoax, even though the intent of the pious hoax is that it be used as a way to kind of, in a way, Indianize the vaccine in the same way that Churchi had done it in China. And so that, to me, is an example of how the message is there, but the messenger is not there. The Brahmins don't pick it up because they don't have the structure of dissemination of information, because they're never meant to reach out to the lower castes. The caste system means that they're pure. In a way, their purity is contingent on their maintaining distance from the lower castes. The lower, and so they don't have either the authority or the desire, or neither are they seen by the lower castes as a source of authority. So the Brahmins are not, and the East India Company doesn't want to do this because it undermines their own gift to India. And so that to me is the one that allows me to separate. And that's also part of the reason why that's the cities, provinces, and countries is to be able to separate out. But unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a good example to do that in China. So if you know of an example of cultural embedding in China that does not take off because it is not communicated by an authoritative institution, you know who to contact.
Hi, I'm Ned Wiley. I've spent 45 years in advertising and marketing, and this is the first time I've had a presentation here that I've really understood. So just to let you know, this is exactly what it's all about. Now, the question that I have, though,
and you've known it.
I hope that doesn't belittle what you're doing.
No.
That was not my intent. But the question I have has to do with something that we're seeing nowadays, and that is this anti-vaccination movement that is in the United States, and I've heard it's also coming over to Germany. And I just wondered if you happen to have any thoughts. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to do any thinking about this. How could you conceive of a narrative, of a mechanism for any of these groups that could possibly be used to persuade them? The only thing I've been able to think of is to force them to do it. That's probably not a good idea.
No, it never works.
But if there's a way, I don't know whether you're going to come up with various goddesses or anything else to try to persuade these people that they should go back and get their vaccinations before everybody else starts getting infected again. Any ideas you have, I think, would be very welcome.
Thank you. So Barrett mentioned that I teach a class on the politics of health and healing back at Brown University. And so one of the assignments that the students had to do was design posters or interventions that were theoretically informed. So they read a lot of, over the course of the semester, they read all of this literature, and their assignment was to come up, based on this, with interventions that would potentially convince anti-vaccinators in Orange County in California. And so to me, the key things is who is a trusted source of authority? Who is seen as legitimate? And whose advice would you follow? And so I think part of the reason, of course, in the US is because of the history of the way in which the state has been viewed, both just in terms of a history of individualism and of a certain thin government or a mistrust of the state, independent of partisanship, and then, of course, you layer on partisanship on that. And so if I had to think of the way in which you might take insights from this historical research into the present day, it's this point about first identifying and then working with the authoritative institutions, so making them the messenger, and then seeing what the established understandings of health, of the body, of healing, of disease, or what the kind of, in a way, existing worldview is. And so some of the more interesting posters and interventions that the students came up with, which I think reflect an engagement, was that the research shows that people, this is all I don't think of this as convincing. But there is some research that the people who resist vaccination, in particular in California, are also those, and this is just a correlation, who believe in alternate forms of medicine or complementary forms of medicine. And so one of the things that they had tried was having publicity in, I think it's called High Flyer, which is the magazine of Whole Foods. And so trying to see where these people shop and embedding this in kind of, things that they would read and see as authoritative. Also using alternate medical practitioners, whether it's yoga instructors or herbal healers or acupuncturists as ways of communicating. And then of embedding this vaccine within existing ways of dealing with the body. And so the thing is that I think that all I can say is I can't give you the answer, but I can give you a roadmap towards the answer. I can tell you what needs to be done to arrive at such an understanding. And so I think the critical thing is I think one of the things that the Brendan Nyhan pediatrics piece shows is that the Center for Disease Control is not always seen as an authoritative institution. So I think it's also reimagining, looking beyond the box in terms of what are their sources of authority, the anti-vaxxers. So I think it's an argument for not dismissing and not engaging. I think the only way towards persuasion is a deep engagement. And that's actually what I think the historical research convincingly shows. And so I think it's both identifying, and that source of authority will vary. It could be an alternative medical practitioner in California. It could be the imam in Pakistan. It could be a CCP cadre in China. And it could be a civil society leader in Berlin, So I think it's depending, it's really context specific, both for the messenger and then a kind of almost ethnographic understanding of what the existing understandings are that allow us to align a message, either cognitively or affectively.
Okay, may I? My name is Heiko Günther. I'm working in the healthcare industry. And you have based your research on one disease, on a certain disease, smallpox. I wonder if during your research you have also got information if similar success factors have played a role in the other big success story of the 20th century, eradication of polio. I mean, at least in my opinion, it's a success story and it's near to eradication. And have you heard about if these soft factors or motivating frame, cognitively motivating frames or effectively motivating frames have played a role in eradicating poliomyelitis in the 20th century?
Thank you. So one of the great things about being a fellow is that we get to have breakfasts and dinners with our fellow fellows. And as I mentioned, Anne is here. And so one of the things I'm really hoping to learn is to kind of see if any of these insights travel both in the contemporary period and in the historical period to the study of polio. Because I certainly don't want this book to be, as I mentioned, I have reasons for looking at smallpox, both methodological reasons, but also substantive reasons. But really the book is about the control of contagion. And it's about how we are motivated to take on technologies and behaviors that would allow us to do it. And so I spoke about AIDS. I also would hope that this, and I think it does, generalize to SARS, H1N1, and a variety of other epidemics. But I also think really of the study of disease as a site of interaction between states and societies. And so to me, the question of why you vaccinate or don't is not dissimilar from the question of why you pay your taxes or don't, or why you vote or don't, or why you join a volunteer army or don't. These are all costly acts that involve sacrifices of money, of time, of your body, potentially, of your life. And to me, the sources of motivation that would lead to one of these types of behavior can resonate and inform others. And so the short answer is I haven't researched polio enough to know. I do know anecdotally that, for instance, the use of religious leaders as messengers has been shown to be a much more effective strategy in parts of Pakistan. I mean, also it's important not to forget that the person who knocked on Osama bin Laden's door was a polio vaccinator. And so there is also a kind of emerging literature on the repercussions of that for the polio campaign in Pakistan. And so I think polio is a fascinating disease, and certainly one that I think all of us here in the room hope will be the next one on the list of diseases to be eradicated. But as I said, it's both polio, it's other diseases, but it's really about these other types of action that involve this kind of close interaction between states and societies.
Is this on? I'm George Frampton. I'm a fellow also. I want to just sort of follow up on the question I thought our marketing expert was actually going to ask. Have you studied or looked at, aware of people who've used social marketing techniques to try to, distribute, promote public health strategies? There's one organization, certainly in the U.S., that's been extremely successful with using USAID and World Health money to distribute condoms in Bangladesh and in Africa on the proposition that if birth control is distributed through government health agencies, that's not an authority that's respected. And that if you can advertise and do this in a subsidized way through the market, by advertising condoms on cheap sales that are sold to boat people in Bangladesh or to truck drivers in Africa in places where they buy other things that are attractive. So I'm thinking about that in terms of somehow using the market to promote cultural acceptability as opposed to taking something from the government. I'm not plugging the market. I mean, as I'm thinking about this, opioids is an example of you can use the market, and if you have enough money, you can convince the public that doing something that's bad for them, is culturally okay and acceptable too. But the idea of coping in a situation in which the government health authorities are not a sufficiently credible authority, that you have to go someplace else to promote the idea of cultural acceptance.
Thank you. I think it's a very good question. I think I'm not sure that I would think of the market at all historical periods or in different places as necessarily an authoritative institution. I think, again, that varies. I mean, I think of some of the backlash to vaccines, of course, have come from specific vaccines that have been broadcast through marketing techniques of the kind I think that you're referring to, for instance, the vaccine against cervical cancer. And I think the association between big pharma and the promotion of vaccines is often a connection that a lot of people who hesitate about vaccines cite as a reason for their hesitancy. So I think the market can go in many different ways. I think, the endorsement by companies, just like endorsement by states. I think it really depends, again, both on the message, but also on how they're seen. Also, in most parts of the developing world, despite globalization, or perhaps even because of it, the state remains a primary actor in the provision of these technologies. And so a lot of, for instance, for polio, these are really state campaigns. These are state campaigns are now aided increasingly by multilateral institutions and international health foundations. But in much of the recent health campaigns, public health campaigns, the role of the market has not been as much as we might imagine. I think, however, it does leave open this question because the market has been extremely good. I mean, so one of the things that I have been studying is Colgate. So Colgate managed to convince, in the matter of less than a generation, Indian residents of the Indian countryside to go from using a datun, which is a free branch of a tree that you can pick off, a neem tree, and which is now among a lot of people in my yoga studio, come back as toothbrushes. You can actually buy them in a street market in Berlin. I discovered recently you can buy sticks of licorice, and you can also buy these sticks of the neem tree. And they're lovely, they're not lovely, they're very bitter, but they're extremely natural, sustainable brushes. But Colgate comes in to the Indian countryside and manages to convince Indians to both buy toothbrushes, poor Indians, toothbrushes and a toothpaste, as compared to literally walking out and getting a small branch of a tree, which is now shown to be about as effective, perhaps more than this. And so what I'm saying is that I think there is a role for the market. There certainly has been a role for the market in health behaviors more broadly. But in terms of the control of disease, especially in the developing world, I feel as if the role of the market has been less. And therefore, we've thought about it less theoretically. So it's more empirically, it hasn't been present. And so theoretically, I'm not quite sure how to think about it. But I think it's a great question. Thank you.
All right. Last question.
Thank you for this brilliant and entertaining presentation, Prerna. I enjoyed it very much. I have a question regarding the messenger and the institution of messenger. I think that currently we are in a revolution of this institution of messengers when we look at influencers and social media. I think there's a radical change in this, and it's kind of a system, I think, that people my age don't even understand or not able to understand. It's like a parallel universe, which is very well used now by the market, by companies. Young people not watching TV, but watching videos of influencers with clicks in the millions, billions, with huge impact we only can imagine. But what do you think, what is the consequence of this revolution of institution of messenger, and how would politics need to react to this, and what can we learn from this? Especially when it comes to questions like public health and...
So my short answer is that Paul and Umajan are going to tell us this. Our kids go to Kita together, so I have a feeling that they're going to be much more in the know. But I think the critical, issue again is about are these seen as authoritative sources of information? And in the world of the way we process news now, perhaps. And so to some extent, I think this reflects the historical case studies, that I'm really thinking in terms of civil society actors and thinking in terms of religious leaders, village elders, state actors. And you're absolutely correct in that perhaps also reflecting my age, my domain has not shifted to the role of influencers. I will say this is that there are studies of what takes off and what goes viral. And I think a lot of these studies do point to certain things, not all, that resonate with the argument that I've put forward. And so, for instance, being able to, so this idea that we necessarily act like self-interested, interest-maximizing economic actors, like Homo economicus, I think that has been shown even in the world of social media to not be the case. So what we click on, or what we follow, or who we follow, in a way defies reason. You know, why did you just spend 30 minutes looking at cat videos? I don't know, it's not quite the same, but it's, I think this idea that we necessarily make decisions, or we form opinions, and then we act based on an unbiased processing of information has been shown to also not be the case among influencers. So it's not the case that if you look at, so they have, for instance, expert appraisals of influencers, and they say, okay, so, you know, this is the influencer who should go viral, or this is the video that should go viral, based on that understanding of human motivation and behavior. And it turns out it's not. And I think there they have shown that the role, for instance, of emotion, of how it makes you feel, of the way, of the values that it taps into, the norms, the way it links to established beliefs, that all of those are actually much more important predictors of whether something becomes viral or influencing as compared to simply the facts, the content. So I think that much I can say is the case. Beyond that, I think that's why this is so exciting, is because we now have all of these extra domains through which we can work towards, I think, this absolutely critical challenge of countering the diseases, and especially those that affect our children.
All right. Prerna, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
a fascinating and thoughtful talk.